The phones inside the National Hurricane Center started ringing at the same time the new model runs finished processing, and what the forecasters saw on their screens in that moment, what the data was telling them had just happened to the storm's projected track, was serious enough that they did not wait for the next scheduled advisory cycle. They issued a special advisory, an unscheduled, out-of-cycle, drop everything and read this special advisory, the kind that the National Hurricane Center only publishes when something has changed so significantly, so suddenly and so consequentially that waiting another 3 hours for the normal advisory schedule would mean millions of people spending 3 hours making decisions based on information that is no longer true. And what that special advisory said, what the new track guidance is now showing with a consistency and a confidence that has forecasters deeply alarmed, is that this storm has shifted, not wobbled, not drifted slightly outside the previous cone in a way that falls within normal forecast uncertainty. Shifted, meaningfully, dramatically, and in the single worst direction, could have shifted from the perspective of human exposure, population density, and community preparedness. The communities that spent the last 48 hours watching this storm on the news from what they believed was a safe distance. The cities and counties and coastal neighborhoods that were outside the previous cone, that were not under watches or warnings, that had not activated their emergency operations centers because the forecast track kept them in the secondary threat zone, those communities woke up this morning in a completely different situation than the one they went to sleep in. And the terrifying part is that some of them do not know it yet. Let me tell you exactly what happened, because the mechanics of how a hurricane track shifts are not random and they are not mysterious, and understanding why this storm moved is inseparable from understanding why forecasters are now so alarmed about where it is going. Hurricane track is controlled by the large-scale atmospheric steering pattern, the arrangement of high and low, pressure systems in the upper levels of the atmosphere that essentially act as a river current, carrying the storm along their flow the way a leaf gets carried downstream. Forecasters watch that steering pattern constantly, updating their track predictions as the models ingest new observational data and adjust their solutions. Most of the time, the steering pattern is stable enough that track forecasts at 48 to 72 hours carry reasonable confidence. Not perfect, but good enough that the cone of uncertainty represents an honest picture of the plausible range of outcomes. What happened with this storm is that the steering pattern did not behave the way the models were projecting. A ridge of high pressure that was forecast to hold its position to the north and east of the storm, the atmospheric wall that was supposed to keep the storm on its previous track, weakened faster than any of the major forecast models captured in their previous runs. When that ridge weakened, the steering current that had been guiding this storm shifted. And when the steering current shifted, the storm followed it, westward, into a track corridor that is more populated, more vulnerable, and dramatically less prepared than the areas the previous forecast was targeting. The new track consensus is not ambiguous, and it is not a single outlier model run that could be dismissed as noise in the guidance. The American GFS model, the European ECMWF, the Canadian model, and the ensemble guidance from both the GFS and ECMWF have all shifted in the same direction in the last 12 hours, converging on a new track solution that places landfall in a corridor that was not the primary focus of public warnings, emergency management activation, or evacuation preparation as of yesterday evening. When multiple independent modeling systems shift simultaneously in the same direction, that is not a coincidence, and it is not a forecast artifact. It is the models responding to the same observed change in the atmospheric steering pattern, and it is one of the clearest signals forecasters have that a track shift is real, significant, and likely to verify. The spread between the model solutions, the measure of how much disagreement exists between different forecast systems, has actually decreased with this shift, meaning the models are not just moving westward together, they are agreeing more with each other on the new track than they were agreeing on the old one. More agreement on a worse track for more populated communities. That is the situation right now, and every hour of additional model runs that comes in is reinforcing it rather than reversing it. The communities now sitting inside the primary threat corridor need to understand something specific about their situation that is different from the situation facing communities that have been in the cone since the storm formed. Preparation is not just a function of willingness, it is a function of time. And the communities that are now directly in this storm's path have dramatically less time than the communities that were in the original forecast track, because those communities have been preparing for days. They have been buying supplies, filling prescriptions, boarding windows, making evacuation decisions, moving to shelters, positioning their families at the homes of relatives inland. The infrastructure of preparation, the supply chain of plywood and generators and bottled water and batteries, the highway capacity of evacuation routes running at manageable traffic volumes, the availability of hotel rooms and shelter, spaces in communities outside the threat zone, All of that infrastructure has been absorbing the demand from the original threat corridor for 48 to 72 hours. The communities now entering the threat zone for the first time are arriving at the back end of that supply and capacity pipeline, and what they are going to find when they go to the hardware store. When they try to fill their gas tank, when they call ahead to book a hotel room on the evacuation route, is a pipeline that has already been significantly drained by the preparation activity of everyone who has been in this forecast longer than they have. Time matters in hurricane preparation. Time is the resource that all the money and all the willingness in the world cannot replace. And right now, the communities that need time the most are the ones that have the least of it. Let me be specific about the geographic shift, because the difference between the old track and the new track is not an abstraction. It is a set of specific communities, specific counties, specific metropolitan areas that have moved from one category of threat to another in the span of a single forecast cycle. The previous track corridor was aimed at a relatively lower density stretch of coastline where the population exposure, while serious, was manageable within the framework of the warning and evacuation infrastructure that had been activated. The new track corridor is aimed at a significantly more densely populated section of coastline, a corridor that includes major metropolitan areas with millions of residents, barrier island communities with large permanent and seasonal populations, and inland urban centers that sit within the zone of catastrophic storm surge inundation under a major hurricane landfall scenario. The difference in population exposure between the old track and the new track is not marginal. It is the kind of difference that transforms a serious regional disaster into a potentially catastrophic mass casualty event if the preparation and evacuation response does not match the scale of the threat in the compressed time frame that remains before landfall. Emergency managers in the newly threatened corridor are activating their operations centers right now. Evacuation orders are being prepared or have already been issued for the most vulnerable surge zones, and the clock that those emergency managers are working against is running faster than anyone in those communities has had a chance to fully absorb. The storm surge threat in the new track corridor is the detail that I need you to hear with the most urgency, because storm surge is what kills in a hurricane, and the surge profile for a major hurricane making landfall in a more densely populated coastal corridor is not just a numbers problem, it is a geometry problem. Storm surge does not distribute itself evenly across a coastline. It concentrates. It piles up in bays, in estuaries, in the concave sections of coastline where the geometry of the land traps the water that the storm's winds are pushing on shore and prevents it from spreading laterally. The new track corridor contains exactly those geometric features: enclosed bays, river mouths, barrier island systems with limited elevation and limited escape routes, coastal communities where the land between the beach and the nearest high ground is measured in fractions of a mile rather than in meaningful distances. In those environments, storm surge values under a major hurricane can exceed the values that the simple wind speed-based surge tables suggest, because the local geometry amplifies the surge beyond what the storm's raw meteorological parameters would indicate. The surge modeling for the new track is being updated right now, and the preliminary output from the National Hurricane Center's surge inundation models is showing values in the most exposed locations that are, in the bluntest possible terms, unsurvivable for anyone who has not evacuated. Values that put water above the roof lines of single-story structures. Values that submerge the ground floors of two-story homes completely. Values that turn the roads connecting barrier island communities to the mainland into channels of moving water hours before the storm center makes landfall, eliminating the escape route that residents might otherwise have used if they had waited too long to leave. These are not the words of outside critics. These are the words of people inside Google describing their own product in emails that later surfaced in federal court. And yet, for years, hundreds of millions of people opened incognito mode and believed they were private. Google also quietly used, after the settlement, Chrome updated its incognito mode disclaimer. The old text said, "Now you can browse privately." The new text says, "You can browse more privately." That one word, more, is doing an enormous amount of work. It is not private, it is more private. Compared to what, exactly, is a question Google prefers you don't ask. Above normal rainfall has left soil saturated and rivers running above their normal seasonal levels, meaning that the additional rainfall from this storm's outer bands and core circulation will have less capacity to absorb into the ground and will run off faster and more completely into waterways that are already carrying elevated flow. Flash flooding in the urban portions of the new track corridor is not a secondary concern attached to the surge and wind threats. It is a standalone catastrophic hazard that will begin producing life-threatening conditions hours before the storm's center makes landfall, and will continue producing them for 24 to 48 hours after the center has passed. Inland communities that are 50, 75, 100 miles from the coast and that are not under any surge-related evacuation orders are nevertheless facing a serious flash flooding and river flooding threat that demands specific preparation and specific awareness of local flood risk. The tornado threat embedded in this storm's outer rain bands is another hazard that the track shift has moved onto the doorstep of communities that were not previously in that threat zone. Landfalling hurricanes produce tornadoes, not as a rare or unusual event, but as a consistent and documented feature of their outer band structure. The tornadoes that spin off in the outer rain bands of a landfalling hurricane are particularly dangerous because they are typically rain-wrapped, meaning they are embedded within heavy rainfall that makes them invisible to observers on the ground until they are essentially overhead. They are also frequently occurring at night, when visibility is already reduced and the population is less likely to be actively monitoring weather alerts. The track shift has moved the primary outer band tornado threat zone over communities that have not been in any formal watch or warning for the previous 48 hours. Communities where the public awareness of today's tornado threat is dramatically lower than it would have been if those communities had been in the cone since the beginning. Local emergency managers in those areas are working right now to communicate the outer band tornado threat to their residents, but they are doing it against a background of public attention that is naturally focused on the surge and wind impacts closer to the coast, and the risk is that the tornado message gets lost in the larger storm narrative until the warnings are already being issued and the lead time has collapsed to minutes. Here's the conversation that emergency managers in the newly threatened corridor are having with each other right now. And I want to share it with you because it captures the operational reality of the situation more honestly than any forecast graphic can. The conversation is about timing, specifically about the gap between when the evacuation orders are issued and when the evacuation routes become impassable. In a well-resourced, well-timed evacuation from a hurricane threat corridor, that gap should be at least 24 hours, ideally 36 to 48. Because moving large numbers of people out of a coastal area on a limited highway network takes time even under ideal conditions, and conditions during a hurricane evacuation are never ideal. Traffic contraflow operations, the process of reversing inbound highway lanes to increase outbound evacuation capacity, take time to set up, require coordination between multiple state and local agencies, and only work effectively if they are implemented early enough that the evacuation flow can clear the at-risk zone before the storm's outer bands make driving dangerous. The communities now in this storm's path are working with a timeline that is compressed compared to what a textbook hurricane preparedness scenario prescribes. The evacuation orders that are being issued or prepared right now are going out later in the storm's approach than anyone would prefer. The contraflow operations that are being activated are doing so with less lead time than the standard planning documents call for. And the residents who are receiving evacuation orders for the first time today are making decisions that residents in the original threat corridor had days to process and plan for. What that means for you specifically, if you are in the newly threatened corridor, if you received an evacuation order in the last several hours, or if you are in a surge zone that has now been included in mandatory evacuation areas, is that the time for deliberation has passed? I want to say that as directly and as plainly as possible because the research on hurricane evacuation behavior consistently shows that the single biggest predictor of whether people evacuate when they should is whether they believe the threat is real and imminent. And right now, there is a subset of the population in the new threat corridor that is still processing the track shift, still adjusting their mental model from yesterday's forecast to today's reality, still in the stage of psychological response that researchers call normalcy bias, the deeply human tendency to interpret new information through the lens of past experience and to underestimate the probability of outcomes that fall outside that experience. If you have never been in a direct hurricane strike, if your previous experience with hurricanes has been outer bands and power outages and a few downed trees and then cleanup, if your mental model of what this storm means for your neighborhood is based on those previous experiences, rather than on what the surge inundation models are now showing for your specific location under a direct major hurricane strike, you need to update that model right now, today, before the outer bands arrive and the roads begin to flood and the window closes. Leave if you are in a surge zone. Leave now, not after you finish packing everything you want to take. Pack what you genuinely cannot. Live without and leave. Not after you make a few more phone calls. Make the call that tells the people who need to know where you're going and then get in the car and go. Not after you see how the storm looks on the radar tonight. The radar tonight is going to show you a major hurricane that is already close enough that the outer bands are affecting your ability to drive safely, and at that point the decision you are trying to make has already been made for you by the atmosphere. The evacuation routes are open right now. The gas stations along those routes still have fuel right now. The shelters inland still have capacity right now. All of those things are true in this moment, and none of them are guaranteed to be true 6 hours from now. because every hour that passes is an hour of additional evacuation traffic on the roads, additional fuel demand at the stations, additional intake at the shelters, and additional deterioration in the driving conditions as the storm's outer bands begin to push weather into the region. If you are not in a surge zone, but you are in the new track corridor, your preparation checklist is specific and it is urgent. Your emergency kit needs to be complete before tonight. 7 days of water, 7 days of food, medications, flashlights, battery banks, a weather radio that operates without grid power. Your generator needs to be fueled and positioned outside, never inside, no matter what the conditions are. Your important documents need to be in a waterproof container or a digital backup that you can access from anywhere. Your vehicle needs a full tank of gas. Your family needs a communication plan that does not depend on cell service, because cell networks in a major hurricane landfall zone become overloaded and then damaged. And the assumption that you will be able to reach your family members by phone during and after the storm's passage is an assumption that the post-storm communication environment in a direct strike scenario does not reliably support. This storm just got a lot worse, not in intensity alone, though the intensity remains catastrophic, but in the specific, devastating, consequence-laden sense that it is now aimed at people who were not fully prepared for it. Communities that are running a preparation deficit measured in days, residents who are making in hours the decisions that their neighbors in the original threat corridor had days to make carefully. The track shift is real. The new threat corridor is real. The surge values, the wind field, the rainfall totals, the tornado threat, the compressed evacuation timeline, all of it is real. All of it is documented in official forecast products from the National Hurricane Center. And all of it demands a response that matches the urgency of what the atmosphere is now delivering. Stay with the National Hurricane Center. Follow your local emergency managers. Obey the evacuation orders. Keep every alert active on every device. And please, in the time that remains before this storm arrives, do everything it takes to make it through safely.